Hello, everybody. This is Dr. DeMaio, and this is a live recording on the digestive system. So in digestive system, we're going to look at the term digestion. What does it mean? The gross anatomy of all the digestive organs. The physiology of digestion of just a very brief viewpoint of it. It's not as detailed as you would expect. It's only 33 slides. To do that, we would be here all day. Accessory organs and nervous control. Very short and sweet. So digestion defined is the process by which the body breaks down large complex foods into their smaller building blocks in order to facilitate the next steps, which is absorption and assimilation. So when you digest food, you have to break it down, you have to absorb it, and then the key is assimilate it, right? What does assimilation mean? Your ability to utilize those things that you digested, right? And that has to get into the cells, and the cells have to be able to utilize it to make those products. We talked earlier about thyroid enlargement and how you don't have enough of the product, so sometimes the thyroid gets enlarged. That's one reason. It's not the only reason why you get an enlarged thyroid. A lot of times it's because you have an autoimmune response. However, if you want to keep healthy hormones and healthy products in your body and keep your body functioning normally, I mean, even just hemoglobin, we were just talking about hemoglobin has this high affinity for oxygen. If you don't have enough iron, you're not going to be able to have a healthy hemoglobin, right? If you don't have enough globular protein, so globular proteins are made up of amino acids. We've talked about the immune system. If you don't have enough amino acids to make the antibodies, you can't have those antibodies. You don't have enough lipids to make certain things. So we have to be able to assimilate the food, not just break it down. So you'll see as we go through this topic, you have the accessory organs like the liver and the gallbladder, which are involved in the absorption of fats. We need to have certain fats in our diet. Also, throughout the entire intestinal tract is absorption. And we have even the lacteals to absorb fats as well. So we digest proteins into amino acids, and the amount of proteins you take in and the types of proteins determines what amino acids you're going to break down to, right? If you're eating the same food over and over again, it's quite possible you don't have as diverse an amino acid compounds that you need, because there are 8 essential for life. Fats and triglycerides. Triglycerides is a glycerol and 3 fatty acids, but it's not the only fat we digest. You must be taking in your essential oils, essential fats, such as your fish oils are really important, or avocado oil. These are all good high antioxidant oils that help prevent cancer and help prevent cardiovascular disease. Complex carbohydrates such as starch and glycogen are digested into, that should be a separate word, glucose, right? Gross anatomy of the digestive tract, the human anatomy, we explain this in the lab, and we explain this in AP1, a tube within a tube. You think about it, you have the air tubes, we talked about the respiratory airways, and within another tube, and then we have the thoracic cavity, which is a tube basically, and then your abdominal cavity has the tube from the mouth to the anus, plus other organs that are like tubes, right? So the GI tract can be found, that should be the word found, not fond, within the abdominal pelvic cavity. The abdominal pelvic cavity can be broken down anatomically into the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. This can be found in chapter 1 of your textbook. The abdominal pelvic cavity is lined by a serous membrane called the parietal peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum are the coverings of each individual organ within that GI tract. So viscera means organs. A visceral peritoneum is actually a membrane surrounding each organ. The peritoneal cavity is the space in between those organs and the cavity. It contains a peritoneal fluid. So you have an abdominal cavity that has the stomach, intestines, spleen, liver, and other organs. Then you have a pelvic cavity. So we combine this and call it the abdominal pelvic, because there's no demarcation, no membrane that separates, like in the thoracic cavity, had the diaphragm separating above and below. So we call it the abdominal pelvic cavity, but in the abdominal cavity region, that's where these organs, and then in the pelvic cavity, you have these organs, the bladder, some reproductive organs, and the lower portion of the intestinal tract, which would have the rectum. Now, the serous membranes line the walls of the cavities and cover the viscera. We just talked about that. The GI tract layers include a visceral peritoneum, a musculosa, a submucosa, and a mucosa. So we're talking about the GI tract. The GI tract is that tube from the mouth to the anus. So there is a serosa on the outside of the tube. There's a musculosa, right? And there's a submucosa, and then a mucosa. So this is the inside of the lumen right here, and they have these villi. See an increasing surface area, this villi. So the visceral peritoneum is the serous membrane covering the organ. That's on the outside, covering the organ, the part of the intestine, let's say. The musculosa is a smooth muscle that helps perform peristalsis, which is the movement, allows the movement of food. The submucosa is the connective tissue that anchors the mucosa to the musculosa. And then you have the mucosa, which is the innermost layer. And that's an epithelial tissue lining these villi. And that's the site of most of your digestion and absorption. The oral cavity, remember it's shared a space for the airway as well, has the lips, the teeth, the palate, the uvula, and the tongue and the salivary glands. So the posterior boundary of the oral cavity has that uvula. We haven't talked much about that uvula. That's coming down from the soft palate. That's that punching bag. And we'll talk about it in a moment. And you can see right below that would be the palatine tonsil. And then here's your lingual tonsil, palatine tonsil. Up here is your pharyngeal tonsil. This is your eustachian tube. So the uvula is just below the eustachian tube, and it's hanging down in that oral cavity. Of course, you have the lips, and then the inside of your cheek is involved as well. It doesn't talk about the cheek in here, you know. When you have the palate, you have the hard palate and the soft palate, and you have the tongue and the salivary glands. Okay, so salivary glands are not really shown here. They're not showing the glands too well here. Okay, so what is the purpose of the lips as far as digestion is concerned? Because there's other purposes, right? You know, kissing is a purpose, right? There's two large fleshly folds that line the opening of the oral cavity, composed of skeletal muscle called the orbicularis oris. You remember that from A&P1? Circular muscle around the mouth. The external surface is just covered with a hard, dry, pigmented skin. There are no sweat glands on the lips. Interesting. The internal surface is covered by mucous membrane. The functions of the lips include 1. Sealing the oral cavity. 2. Manipulating food into the oral cavity. 3. Protecting the oral cavity. There's a lot of sensory nerves on the lips. There, as a matter of fact, if you look at the homunculus man, that drawing that they have about the somatosensory cortex, the portions of the somatosensory cortex that are dedicated to the lips, it's huge. Not only for sensory, but for motor. You have good control of the lips. Remember, we learned about speaking. Our lips are involved in speaking as well. So speech is a fourth one. The teeth. Okay, what's the purpose of our teeth in digestion? They're small, hard, bony structures located in the oral cavity. Yeah, tell me something new. Composed of enamel with dentin underneath, there's a root canal that contains the arterial, venule, lymphatic vessel, and nerves. The crown is the portion above the gums. The gums are termed gingiva. It's used for gums. And the cementum is the bone-like substance that connects the root to the periodontal ligament. And the periodontal ligament forms a flexible anchor for the tooth. It prevents the tooth from breaking and allows the tooth to alter its cutting edge while chewing. Okay, the functions. What are the functions of the teeth? Chewing or mastication, decreasing the size of the food to facilitate swallowing, and that also increases the surface area of that food for enzymes to digest it. Breaks cell walls of plants to release the nutrients, and mixes food with saliva. The palate, the roof of the mouth, composed of a hard palate anteriorly and a soft palate posteriorly. The hard palate is made up of bone with a mucous membrane, and it provides a rigid support for dentition and chewing, for your teeth and chewing. The soft palate is primarily made up of smooth muscle with a mucous membrane. This is a flexible membrane and facilitates swallowing. The uvula, the flap of tissue extending from the soft palate, composed of a mucous membrane, connective tissue, and variable contributions of cranial nerves. The main function of the uvula is covering the nasopharynx during swallowing and the gag reflex. You know, when a doctor takes a tongue depressor and puts it on the back of your tongue, purposely touching the uvula to trigger and see if you have a normal gag reflex. When he has you say, ah, what is he looking for? He's looking at the position that the uvula moves. If it just moves to the right, that means the cranial nerve could be damaged on the other side. So it should go back and forth both ways. It should like vibrate left and right as you say, ah, like a punching bag. If it only goes to one side, it could indicate a cranial nerve damage. The tongue, a large muscular organ in the oral cavities composed of skeletal muscle, a mucous membrane, and specialized chemoreceptors for taste, or the taste buds. The functions of the tongue is taste. You have different parts of the tongue for sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umau. What the heck is umau? That's from that song, Abapa Umau Mount. No, it's not from that song. Umau is like a savory taste, like a beef broth taste. And usually in the back of the tongue is where that's received. And also the tongue will manipulate food in the mouth, helps to form what's called a bolus, and then secretes even enzymes. There's enzymes on the tongue called lingual lipase to start breaking down fats. And of course, we know that the tongue is involved in speech already because we did that in the respiratory. Salivary glands. The glands that secrete saliva into oral cavities, three major salivary glands: parotid, submandibular, and sublingual. The parotids are the ones located on the skin and the masseter muscle, and they secrete digestive saliva into the oral cavity via, that should be, not visa, you could say vis-a-vis, but via the Stenson's duct or the parotid duct. So it has a large duct going into the cheek. The submandibular glands, one of my favorites because of NGF, are located beneath the buccal mucosa under the floor of the mouth. They secrete their products into the oral cavity via what's called Wharton's ducts. The submandibular gland is sometimes called the submaxillary gland for some reason, and this gland produces two distinct types of saliva. You have the saliva of digestion, which is influenced by the parasympathetic nerves, and the sympathetic nerves. This NGF is released by the sympathetic nerves. And this is a chemical that's more viscous. So the saliva of the sympathetic nervous system is more viscous, thicker. And that's where you get that cotton mouth when you're nervous. The saliva of the parasympathetic is more watery. And that's under the influence of the parasympathetic nervous system, meaning during digestion and relaxation. When you're stressed, you can produce saliva from this gland, and that saliva will have a very small amount, but it's very powerful, of called salivary nerve growth factor, which is necessary to keep the nervous system alive. Without salivary nerve growth factor, neurons will die. And also when nerves heal, they require nerve growth factor to heal. And it wasn't too long ago, they didn't think that the brain, the neurons inside the brain, central nervous system neurons, could heal. But now we know they do. And why? Because there is a direct access under the tongue. So when it's released, the submandibular gland releases it up into the mouth, and it hits under the tongue first, and that is sublingual. There's another gland there called the sublingual gland, but the nerve growth factor is not coming from the sublingual gland. It's coming from the submandibular gland. And it's very specific. This is an area of research in my mind, is that you have, if you look in Gray's Anatomy, we literally have a muscle around the glands. Individual cells, individual epithelial cells have a tiny muscle, and they call them myoepithelial cells. And that muscle squirts the gland, the material out. And that's where you get this viscous material, and it has nerve growth factor. And then it goes under the tongue and goes directly up into the hippocampus of your brain. And so we're dependent upon very, very small amounts. They say that nanograms are only, nerves cannot survive without nanograms. Too much nerve growth factor is damaging. It causes inflammation. Too little, you can't survive. Why the heck am I talking about this? I'll tell you why. And this is, you're going to blow you away, because elevations of nerve growth factor or diminished nerve growth factor, abnormal levels of nerve growth factor, are found in stress, autoimmune disease, and cancer. It's a common denominator of abnormal levels of nerve growth factor, elevated actually. Elevated nerve growth factors are found in people under stress, whether it's acute or chronic, autoimmune disease, and cancer. So that's a pretty important topic, I think. So we'll leave it at that. So that's produced in the submandibular gland, right? Now, the sublingual gland is just beneath the tongue, which would be above the submandibular gland. And it's where absorption of substance can go directly into the hippocampus of the brain. So you could take a sublingual administration of B12 you've heard of, and it goes right into your nervous system to help supply it. All right, now we have the esophagus. And we talked about the trachea. Now we talk about the esophagus. Here's the trachea in yellow, with the larynx and the trachea coming down. Here's the bifurcation here. Here's the heart. And then the esophagus is behind all that. And here it is piercing the diaphragm here. There's the diaphragm. It's a long tubular muscular organ that is collapsible. It's located posterior to the trachea and connected to the pharynx. The approximate 10 inches length begins at the inferior laryngopharynx and ends at the stomach. Right here. Ends here. The esophagus pierces the diaphragm to connect to the stomach. The opening at the diaphragm is called the esophageal hiatus. The internal surface of the esophagus is lined with what? Stratified squamous epithelium, because food is going to be traveling down there and it's abrasive. The functions of the esophagus are transport of ingested materials to the stomach, helping to equalize the temperature of the ingested food to the body temperature, and the lower esophageal sphincter is considered to be a physiological sphincter. What do I mean by that? Is not, you don't see a very clear valve. It's just excess muscle around it, and it's physiological. There is an upper esophageal sphincter, but it's really not much that's talked about when we talk about problems in the stomach, but there is an upper esophageal sphincter as well. The stomach, a large muscular organ located between the esophagus and the small intestine. 3 layers of smooth muscle allow the stomach to mix the chyme. So the bolus went down the esophagus as a bolus, and now it's becoming a chyme. It's going to be broken down even further. And the 3 layers of the smooth muscle include the circular, longitudinal, and oblique. And you can see the 3 layers. The functions of smooth muscle, the functions of the stomach are or include storage of food and secretion of gastric juice. Inside the stomach, it's modified to increase surface area called the rugae. There are large folds in the stomach that increase the surface area and allow the stomach to expand. Then deep into those folds are these gastric pits, small microscopic folds of tissue lined with columnar epithelium that also increase surface area of the stomach, and the gastric glands secrete the gastric juice. There are two cells important here. The chief cells secrete pepsinogen and gastric lipase, whereas the parietal cells secrete hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. The gastric juice contains mucus, which lubricates and protects the stomach wall from those acids, and pepsinogen, which is an enzyme precursor of pepsin protease. And then hydrochloric acid is going to convert pepsinogen into pepsin and controls the growth of microbes in the stomach. Hormones, not an exhaustive list, a very short list. Gastrin, serotonin, histamine, and somatostatin. Gastrin is released in response to food entering the stomach, especially if its proteins and acetylcholine from nerves cause the gastric glands to release hydrochloric acid. It stimulates gastric emptying. The serotonin, stimulated by food entering the stomach, causes the contraction of the stomach. And histamine, stimulated by food entering the stomach, causes the parietal cells to release the hydrochloric acid. Somatostatin is stimulated by food in the stomach and sympathetic nerves and causes the inhibition of gastric and all gastric products, gastric motility, and emptying. So it stops it, right? When you want to empty the stomach, or stomach emptying or gastric emptying, the stomach usually empties within 4 hours after a normal-sized meal. However, the greater the stomach distension or stretch, the faster the stomach empties. This includes liquids as well as solids. Fluids usually pass quicker and need to be converted into chyme. The rate of gastric stomach emptying is monitored by the stomach and the duodenum, or small intestine. The contents and the amount of food in the duodenum play a greater role than the stomach does in gastric emptying. So whatever left that stomach and hit the duodenum, it will play a bigger role in whether the stomach is going to continue emptying or not. So as chyme enters the duodenum, the receptors in the duodenum wall respond to both chemical and mechanical stretch. This initiates what's called the enterogastric reflex, or chemical stretch reflex, and the enterogastrone hormone mechanisms that inhibit gastric secretory activity. This prevents further filling of the duodenum. The type of food that enters the duodenum will alter the stomach emptying. Carbohydrate-rich foods move fast, and fatty meals move slow. So that food could remain in the stomach 6 hours or more. One of the reasons why a diabetic individual wants to if they want to maintain their blood sugar, they should not have many carbohydrate meals throughout the day alone. Whenever they eat, they should add a little bit of fat, a little bit of protein, and a little bit of carbohydrate so that it slows the emptying of the stomach. If you slow the emptying of the stomach, you slow the absorption of those foods, and therefore, if it's less carb and more fat, there's going to be sitting in the stomach and not raise your blood pressure suddenly. It'll be a slow process. Also, the fat helps you to feel more satiated because it keeps the stomach stretched, and the reflexes are telling you you're full. Launching lunch, or emesis, or vomiting, controlled by the emetic center of the medulla, stimulated by both blood-borne molecules and sensory input from excessive food stretching of the stomach. That should be spelled with a U, that bloodborne, B-O-U-R-N-E. So as you have something that you ate, could have chemicals in it that are irritative, or too much stretching and excessive stretching from too much food, you know, these food eating contests in the stomach or the intestine, or irritants, bacterial toxins, excessive alcohol, spicy foods, and certain drugs could trigger vomiting or emesis. And that's a neurological reflex through chemicals and stretch. The small intestine, a long tubular organ, sometimes some people say 21, some say 28 feet long. I guess it depends on the size of the person, right? Height. Between the stomach and the large intestine, made up of 3 distinct parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And here you see in blue the duodenum, which is retroperitoneal. Oops, let me just erase that for a second. If you notice this blue, it's retroperitoneal. And then the jejunum and the ileum are within the peritoneum. And the duodenum, the small intestine, the duodenum, is only about 10 to 12 inches long, compared to the entire length of the entire small intestine is about 28 feet. The small intestine has this arrangement inside called the plica circularis, and the plica oh my gosh, what's going on here? Plica circularis is these folds, and inside these folds, see, it says here plica circularis. I'm not going to draw anymore because something's happening with my drawing. It keeps changing the page. So I don't know if you can see this red dot. The individual components of the large intestine have individual components, but inside there's a plica circularis and there's villi, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So here's the large intestine now. We're in the large intestine. It's jumped into the large intestine, but the small intestine has 3 areas: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And then the ileum comes into the cecum here of the large intestine. And this is called the ileocecal valve, where it meets in the cecum. I don't know if you can see my red dot there. I'm not going to click it because I'm afraid it's going to change the page on me again. But that is the ileocecal valve. That will open when your body wants to remove stuff from inside your body, inside your intestines. If you're in have diarrhea, what happens is this is stuck open. Your body's trying to release whatever was inside your entire intestinal tract. And so that ileocecal valve is controlled by chemicals and nerves. So a lot of the reflexes in the digestive system are chemically stimulated and nerve stretching of the nerves. So the ileocecal valve is an anatomical valve that controls the flow of the chyme from the small intestine into the large intestine. The cecum is a pouch at the beginning. You have an ascending colon, a transverse colon, a descending colon, and a sigmoid colon. The ascending colon portion of the colon is located vertically on the right. Transverse goes across. Descending goes down, obviously. Sigmoid is an S shape. That's why they call it sigmoid colon. And then the rectum is located distal and runs vertically down to the anus. Now don't forget, the appendix is a large lymphatic organ coming off the cecum. It helps to protect you from microorganisms and cancer. The functions of the large intestine: forming feces by reabsorbing water from chyme. It also stores the feces, and there is a small amount of digestion, usually due primarily by the bacteria that's in there. So if you eat a meat takes a lot longer, like especially red meat takes a long time to digest. It will sit in the large intestine a longer period of time and putrefy, and the bacteria will help to digest the rest of it. That's why it's a good idea to chew your meat really well, right? Okay, and so also there's a lot of bacteria, and plus it's an area for absorption not only of water but also nutrients within the large intestine as well. The bacteria within the colon, there's a very important balance between that and the microorganisms, and it's extremely important for our health. And most people know about that these days, that you should be taking some sort of probiotics to help your GI tract and help your overall health, believe it or not, and your immune system. The functions of the good bacteria include digestion, helping you digest that food better, the prevention of colon cancer by producing an N-butyrate from the fiber, and the production of B vitamins and vitamin K. The good bacteria also prevents the growth of harmful microorganisms in the colon, keeping you healthier and your immune system functioning better. The accessory organs, pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. Oh, it's working now. So this is the diaphragm here, separating the thoracic cavity from the pelvic cavity. Here's the liver, very large organ. It's actually the largest organ. And here's the gallbladder coming off the liver. And you have a couple of things here that are very important. We have a common hepatic duct. And then we have a cystic duct coming from the gallbladder. And you have a pancreatic duct. All of these come together and go into the small intestine in the duodenum at a spot, and that spot is called the duodenal papillae, or the ampulla of Vader. Let's go to the next page. So let's talk about this pancreas for a moment. It is a retroperitoneal organ of the digestive system, which means it's behind the mesentery of the stomach. It's made up of two glands, two types of glands, endocrine and exocrine. We've already spoken about the endocrine glands. We don't need to talk about that right now. And that's usually found in the tail at this islets of Langerhans region, somewhere around here. So you have a pancreas that goes across behind the stomach, and inside is this duct that's coming through it, taking up all those enzymes that are produced by the acinar cells of the pancreas, and they put their material into the duct, and that comes in to go into this small intestine. So the exocrine glands will release sodium bicarbonate. Why? To neutralize the acids that came from the stomach. Because remember, the stomach is emptying in here. This is where the stomach is emptying in at the pylorus sphincter. Food is going to be coming in here. And then your pancreas is going to be releasing sodium bicarbonate to neutralize the acids, and pancreatic amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates, pancreatic lipase, which breaks down fats, and pancreatic protease, which breaks down proteins. The liver, largest glandular organ in the body, it functions, wow, some say 500 functions of the liver. We have 7 of the most obvious here. The production of bile, detoxification, the interconversion of nutrients, the storage of vitamins and minerals, destroying old red blood cells, producing cholesterol and lipoproteins, and immunity. So let's talk about the biliary system, which is part of the liver. So we're going to look at different functions. The biliary system, people need to realize that lipids are basically insoluble in water. The human body needs enzymes to break that down. We saw that from the pancreas. But you can also help those lipids to be absorbed better by emulsifying them. So the liver and the biliary system has to do with that. The biliary system is the production of bile. And so we are carbon-based, and we have carbon-based compounds, which include lipids. It would take a very high temperature to break down those lipids and get absorbed. But the biliary system produces bile that functions to emulsify the lipids. What is emulsification? It's the ability to put the lipids into smaller sized droplets and make micelles, M-I-C-E-L-L-E-S of it, and so that they're more easily absorbed. So the bile functions to emulsify lipids for digestion. And in the process, the detoxification of the liver is occurring and excreting these non-usable toxins into the bile. So the liver is actually detoxifying your body from the blood, and it's actually going to take those bad items that you don't want to stay in your body's blood and puts it into the bile. And that toxin should be removed through defecation, through going to the bathroom, having a bowel movement. That's only done if you have enough adequate or inadequate fiber in your diet and you're having regular bowel movements. Here's the question. What do you think is healthier? 1 bowel movement a day if you're eating 3 meals a day, or 3 bowel movements a day if you eat 3 meals a day? Obviously, if you eat 3 meals a day, you got to get rid of those 3 meals per day. So if you don't have enough fiber and enough water in your diet, you will not be able to remove it, and therefore it gets reabsorbed, and that creates a very toxic individual. And you need water-soluble fiber to do that. So when we look at the anatomy of the biliary system, within the liver, the bile is produced and transported to the common bile duct, and then stored within the gallbladder. The common bile duct continues towards the duodenum. Before entering the duodenum or duodenum, it joins with the cystic duct of the gallbladder. And then it enters the small intestine. It's joined by the pancreatic duct as well. So the common bile duct, the pancreatic duct, and the cystic duct are all coming together into this common bile duct, and they go into the intestine at the hepatopancreatic ampulla, or sometimes called the ampulla of Vater. Here it is, ampulla of Vater, right there. So here's your cystic duct, here's your common hepatic duct, and here's now the common bile duct. Here's the pancreatic duct, and they join together, all of them join together at the ampulla of Vater to release their product in there. Emulsification, again, it's when fat enters the small intestine secretes this hormone called cholecystokinin. That's a hormone. That hormone enters the blood, travels to the gallbladder, and triggers, that should be a T, triggers the release of the stored bile. So the gallbladder will release the bile in response to the fat hitting the duodenum, and it causes the release of the hormone cholecystokinin, CCK. The bile phospholipids and salts surround the lipid and expose only the hydrophilic, remember that's water-loving, of the phospholipid. And now this can enter into the chyme, which is more watery, and the lipids are now disguised by the bile and the phospholipid shield, so the lipid can now mix with the bile and be hydrolyzed. Detoxification. Liver converts toxins into something usable by the body, but sometimes it cannot convert into something usable. This is when it gets dumped into the bile. So now the bile is normally excreted through defecation, as I said before, but sometimes there's not enough fiber to move it out, and it gets reabsorbed. Constipation and the lack of normal bowel movements will create a very toxic body, because you're reabsorbing a concentrated amount of toxins that were supposed to be removed in the bile. The removal of excess cholesterol. The body can remove excess cholesterol through a similar process. What it does, it creates high-density lipoproteins synthesized by the liver and help to transport the excess cholesterol in the tissues back to the liver. The liver can now dump this excess combined HDL cholesterol into the bile. So the bile normally will be excreted in the intestine and removed through defecation. However, again, if you do not eat enough, and I say water-soluble fibers from vegetation, you don't eat enough fiber, and drink enough water, you got to have enough water, you will not excrete it. thus reabsorbing cholesterol back into your body. So it's very important to have a higher fiber diet and lots of water. I know some people like to eat low carb and they eat lots of meats and stuff like that. That's okay, but as long as you're eating the green vegetables, because they're very low carb too, you need that fiber, and you got to make sure you drink more water, because carbohydrate is a word. Hydrate means it has a lot of water. And so OH and H's, which make H2O. So you need to drink more water if you're on a low carb diet, and eat more greens if you're on a low carb diet. Look, celery is very low carb. Broccoli is very low carb. Broccoli actually has a lot of nice protein in it. Nervous control of digestion. The nervous system is broken down into the central nervous system, the CNS, the peripheral nervous system, the PNS, the autonomic nervous system, and the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system has two parts.